The morning disruption. The morning sun filtered through the towering windows of the courthouse, casting golden rays on the city streets as Judge Vanessa Harper approached. Known for her wisdom, poise, and deep sense of justice, Vanessa had become a pillar of her community. Her journey to the bench had not been easy, but she had earned every step through sheer will, hard work, and an unwavering belief in the law's potential to deliver fairness. Today, however, would test her strength in ways she could never have anticipated. As she neared the courthouse steps, the familiar buzz of bustling lawyers, courthouse staff, and citizens filled the air. People moved with a purpose, rushing to morning hearings and meetings. The courthouse had always been her place of solace, a space where the truth was pursued and justice served. But today, as she reached the grand marble staircase, something felt off. Standing at the entrance was a young, white police officer. He was broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that barely concealed an underlying aggression. His eyes locked onto Vanessa as she approached, narrowing with suspicion. Vanessa instantly sensed that this encounter would not be like the many others she'd had at the courthouse door. Something about this officer was different. There was a hatred in his gaze that she'd felt before, a deep-rooted contempt she had spent her life navigating. "Ma'am, you need to stop right there," the officer barked as she stepped closer. His voice was cold, his posture rigid. Vanessa paused, her brow furrowing slightly. She was used to being greeted with respect by courthouse security, not aggression. She glanced down at her judicial robe draped over her arm, the very symbol of her authority and position. But it was clear that this man did not see her status, or perhaps he didn't care. "I'm here for my docket," she responded evenly, taking another step forward. The officer stepped in front of her, blocking her path. "You can't go in," he snapped. "You don't belong here." A wave of disbelief washed over Vanessa. She had encountered discrimination throughout her career, but never at the door of the very courthouse where she was the presiding judge. It wasn't just a misunderstanding. There was something deeper, more personal in his tone. He wasn't just denying her entry. He was making it clear that, to him, her presence here was wrong. "Excuse me." Vanessa's voice remained calm, though her heartbeat quickened. She wasn't afraid. Years of navigating the complexities of her role had steeled her against fear. But this was something else. This was a challenge. The officer sneered. "You don't look like someone who belongs in this courthouse. You need to leave before I call backup." A small crowd of onlookers began to gather, courthouse employees and early morning visitors, slowing their pace as they watched the scene unfold. Some recognized Vanessa immediately, their faces betraying their shock. But no one intervened. Everyone seemed frozen in place, waiting to see what would happen next. Vanessa's mind raced. She could feel the eyes on her, the silent judgment of the crowd. This officer didn't know who she was, or perhaps he did. It didn't matter. What mattered was how she handled this moment, with dignity, composure, and strength. "Officer," she said, her voice low but firm, "I am Judge Vanessa Harper, and I have every right to enter this courthouse." For a brief second, the officer's eyes flickered, betraying a hint of uncertainty. But then, just as quickly, the cold arrogance returned. "I don't care who you are," he spat. "You're not going in. Not today." The words hung in the air, heavy with tension. Vanessa stood her ground, every fiber of her being resisting the urge to retaliate with anger. She could feel the weight of history bearing down on her in that moment, centuries of injustice, prejudice, and discrimination coursing through her veins. This was not just about her. It was about every person who had been told they didn't belong, every person who had been denied their rightful place because of the color of their skin. The officer took another step forward, his hand inching toward the holster on his belt. "I said you're not going in," he repeated, his voice quieter now, but dripping with malice. Vanessa held his gaze, unflinching. She knew she had the law on her side, but in this moment, the law felt distant and intangible. What stood in front of her was a man emboldened by his own sense of superiority, a man who believed that his badge gave him the power to decide who was worthy and who was not. "I have worked in this courthouse for years," Vanessa said slowly, her voice steady. "I've presided over cases that have shaped this city. I have upheld the law with fairness and integrity, and I will not be denied entry by someone who doesn't even know the first thing about justice." The officer's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, a voice called out from behind the crowd, "Is there a problem here?" The crowd parted as a senior officer approached, his expression grave as he took in the scene before him. He glanced at Vanessa, recognition dawning on his face immediately. "Judge Harper, I apologize for any misunderstanding," the senior officer said, his tone respectful. He turned to the young officer, his eyes narrowing. "Officer, step aside." The younger officer hesitated, clearly caught off guard. But after a tense moment, he stepped back, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Vanessa moved past him without a word, her heart still pounding in her chest. As she ascended the courthouse steps, she felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. This wasn't over. It was just the beginning. What she had faced today was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that had been festering for far too long. And she was determined to fight it, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. Inside the courthouse, Vanessa paused for a moment, her eyes sweeping over the familiar halls. Today's docket was full of cases that demanded her attention. But as she sat at her bench, she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Today, justice would not just be served in the courtroom. It had to be served outside of it too. Confronting the system. The day moved on as any other day of the courthouse would. Judge Vanessa Harper sat in her chambers, meticulously reviewing the cases for her afternoon docket. The soft hum of activity from the courthouse halls drifted into her room, but her mind was still anchored to the unsettling encounter that morning. The young officer's hostile gaze, the venom in his voice, and the sickening audacity with which he blocked her from entering the courthouse still weighed heavily on her. Her pen hovered over the case files, but she couldn't focus. The indignity of the morning encounter gnawed at her, more than she expected. It wasn't just a personal affront. It was a symptom of something far deeper, a sickness that ran through the veins of the very institution she had devoted her life to. She had known this sickness her whole career. Racism, subtle or overt, had followed her every step of her ascent to the bench. But to be stopped at the door of the very courthouse where she presided as a judge, it cut deep. Vanessa glanced at the clock. It was almost time for her afternoon hearings. A firm knock on the door startled her out of her thoughts. "Come in," she called. The door opened, revealing Marcus Taylor, her clerk and confidant. He was a young black man, full of ambition and drive, and she had taken him under her wing years ago, seeing in him the same fire that had fueled her early career. Today, however, Marcus's usual vibrant energy was dimmed. His face was tight with concern. "Judge Harper," he began cautiously, stepping into the room and closing the door behind him, "I heard about what happened this morning. Are you okay?" Vanessa set her pen down and leaned back in her chair, releasing a slow, measured breath. "I'm fine, Marcus," she replied, though her voice betrayed the weight of the morning's events. It was just another reminder of the world we live in. Marcus shook his head, his brow furrowed. It wasn't right. Word's already gotten around the courthouse. People are talking about it. They saw what happened, and no one stepped in. Vanessa studied him for a moment. His anger was palpable, simmering beneath the surface. She understood it well. She had been him once, filled with righteous indignation at every injustice she encountered. But years on the bench had taught her to channel that fire into something more productive. Not every battle could be fought with fists or sharp words. Sometimes the most powerful response was calm, calculated action. "They didn't step in because they didn't know what to do," Vanessa said softly. "People freeze when they see things like that. It's easier to pretend it isn't happening." Marcus crossed the room, frustration radiating from his every step. But they did know what to do. They should have said something. They should have intervened. You're Judge Harper, for God's sake. If they won't stand up for you, who will they stand up for? Vanessa raised an eyebrow. It's not about who I am, Marcus. That officer didn't see a judge when he looked at me. He saw a black woman, and that's all that mattered to him. And for some of those bystanders, they saw a confrontation they didn't want to be a part of. People don't stand up for others because they're afraid of what it will cost them. And that's the problem. But it's more than just fear, isn't it? Marcus argued, his voice rising. It's indifference. It's the same indifference that allows people like that officer to get away with this kind of thing every day. Vanessa nodded slowly, acknowledging his point. You're right. But the question is, what do we do about it? I've spent my whole career fighting these battles from the bench, Marcus. I've seen how deeply entrenched this system is in prejudice and injustice. But I also know that change doesn't happen overnight. We have to be strategic. Marcus sat down across from her, the fire in his eyes still burning bright. So, what are we going to do about that officer? He should be held accountable for what he did. Vanessa's gaze hardened, her mind already turning over the possibilities. I've been thinking about that, she admitted. This isn't just about what happened to me today. This is about the larger system that allows people like him to feel emboldened in their actions. It's about every black and brown person who walks into this courthouse and wonders whether justice is really blind. Marcus leaned forward, his interest piqued. What are you thinking? Vanessa sighed, tapping her fingers thoughtfully on her desk. There are a few options. I could file a formal complaint. I could take it up with the police department and demand an investigation into his conduct. But I've seen how those processes work. It would take months, maybe years, and in the end, they might decide it was just a misunderstanding. Marcus's lips tightened. So, what's the alternative? Vanessa smiled, though there was no warmth in it. The alternative is to use the platform I've been given, to make this public, to shine a light on the kind of systemic racism that still exists in places where it shouldn't. Marcus's eyes widened in realization. You're going to make a statement, aren't you? Vanessa nodded. I'm not just going to make a statement. I'm going to use my position, my voice, to demand change. I've worked too hard to get here, and I refuse to let someone like that officer, or anyone else, push me back into silence. Marcus's admiration for her was clear. You're a force, Judge Harper. They're not going to know what hit them. But Vanessa wasn't so sure. She knew the risks involved. To call out the system publicly meant drawing fire from powerful people who had no interest in change. It meant facing backlash, potentially even threats. But she had spent her whole life navigating obstacles. This was just one more. As the afternoon wore on, Vanessa prepared herself for the hearings ahead. But her mind kept drifting back to that morning, to the young officer's sneer, and to the faces in the crowd who had stood by and done nothing. That night, as she sat in her quiet home, the stillness around her was interrupted by the buzzing of her phone. It was a message from an old friend, Rachel Whitfield, a journalist with a major news outlet. They had known each other for years, and Rachel had covered many of Vanessa's landmark cases. But this message was different. I heard what happened at the courthouse today. Rachel's text read, "We need to talk." Vanessa stared at the message for a long time before typing her response. Come by my chambers tomorrow. She knew what Rachel was after. And deep down, Vanessa knew that this was her moment. The moment to confront not just one officer, but the entire system. To shine a light on the racism and prejudice that lurked just beneath the surface of the courthouse's marble halls. But this time, she wouldn't be alone. This time, she had the truth on her side, and a platform to make sure the world heard it. The power of truth. The next morning dawned with a sense of purpose hanging in the air. Judge Vanessa Harper sat in her office, awaiting the arrival of Rachel Whitfield. Her thoughts raced ahead of her. tracing the path that today might take. She had made a decision the night before. This wasn't just going to be a private complaint about a rogue officer. This was going to be a public battle, a confrontation of a system that had far too long allowed bias to reign unchecked. As the clock ticked closer to 10 a.m., there was a knock on her door. Vanessa straightened in her chair. "Come in." Rachel entered, her sharp eyes immediately locking onto Vanessa's. Dressed in a crisp black blazer and armed with her ever-present notebook, Rachel's presence was commanding. She had built a career on uncovering the uncomfortable truths society liked to ignore, and Vanessa knew this would be no different. "Vanessa, it's been a while," Rachel said, her tone warm but laced with the seriousness of her visit. "It has," Vanessa replied, gesturing for Rachel to sit. "I wish we were meeting under different circumstances." Rachel leaned forward, pen poised over her notebook. "I've heard bits and pieces about what happened yesterday, but I need the full story. You know how this works." Vanessa nodded, gathering her thoughts. "It started like any other morning. I was heading into the courthouse for the day, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I reached the entrance, I was stopped by a young police officer." Rachel's eyebrows shot up. "Stopped?" Vanessa nodded. "Yes. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't care. All he saw was a black woman walking toward the courthouse, and that was enough for him to decide that I didn't belong there." The sharp sound of Rachel's pen scratching against the paper filled the room as she took notes. "What exactly did he say?" "He told me I couldn't go in. When I told him I was a judge, he mocked me. He even questioned how someone like me could have achieved that position." Rachel's eyes darkened with anger. And this was all in front of a crowd of courthouse employees and visitors. They all saw it, and no one stepped in. Not until a senior officer arrived and intervened. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing in thought. "This isn't just an isolated incident, Vanessa. You know that. This is part of a larger issue, a systemic issue." Vanessa nodded. "I know. And that's why I wanted to talk to you. This isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows officers like him to feel empowered to treat people this way. And it's not just at the courthouse. It's everywhere. Every day." Rachel's pen had stopped moving. She looked Vanessa in the eyes, her expression resolute. "If we're going to take this public, it has to be big. It can't just be another story that fades into the background after a few days. We need to make sure people understand that this is about more than just one officer's actions." Vanessa leaned forward, the weight of her decision clear in her eyes. "I'm ready for that. I want to expose this for what it is." Rachel paused, considering her words carefully. "You realize the risks, right? Once this story goes public, there's going to be pushback. The police department will circle the wagons. People will say you're blowing things out of proportion, and there will be those who try to paint you as the problem." Vanessa gave a slow, determined nod. "I'm aware of the risks, but I've spent too much time in these halls to stay silent. This isn't just about my dignity. It's about the dignity of every black and brown person who walks into this courthouse and wonders if they'll ever see justice." Rachel smiled, a glint of admiration in her eyes. "I knew you wouldn't back down. All right then, we'll start with an in-depth interview. We'll lay out the facts and talk about your career, your history in the justice system. People need to see that you've earned your place and that this is about the law, not some personal vendetta." Vanessa nodded again. "Agreed. But we also need to talk about the broader implications. I want this story to challenge the way people think about the justice system. I want them to see how systemic racism isn't just about high-profile cases. It's about the everyday interactions that reinforce inequality." Rachel's fingers flew across the page, capturing every word. When she finally stopped, she looked up, her expression focused. "I'm going to write this up, and we'll get it published by the weekend. I'll also speak to a few people I know in the civil rights community. We need to bring as much attention to this as possible." Vanessa sighed in relief. It felt good to have an ally in this fight. Thank you, Rachel. I knew you'd understand. Rachel stood, her notebook tucked under her arm. This is just the beginning, Vanessa. Once this story hits, it's going to cause waves. Be ready for that. Vanessa stood as well, her resolve unshaken. I've been ready for this my whole life. Later that day, as Vanessa prepared for her afternoon hearings, the weight of the morning's conversation lingered in her mind. She knew Rachel was right. The moment the story went public, the backlash would begin. She could already imagine the whispers in the courthouse halls, the thinly veiled comments from certain colleagues. But Vanessa had long since learned that the cost of doing what was right was often steep, and she had never shied away from paying that price. As the hearings progressed, she maintained her usual calm, delivering decisions with the fairness and integrity that had earned her respect throughout the years. But underneath, she couldn't shake the sense that everything was about to change. The power of truth was undeniable, but it was also dangerous. After the last case of the day, Vanessa returned to her chambers, exhausted but resolute. Her phone buzzed, interrupting her thoughts. It was a message from Marcus. You might want to check the news, it read. Frowning, Vanessa pulled up her phone's news app. The headline made her heart skip a beat. Roy CISM in THECOURTs. Black JVG below CKDDF from NT Oring Courthouse by racist officer. Rachel had wasted no time. The story was already live, and it was spreading like wildfire. The article laid out the details of the incident with precision, capturing not just the facts, but the underlying racism that had fueled the encounter. Rachel had done an excellent job, weaving in interviews with civil rights leaders and legal experts who supported Vanessa's stance. The piece wasn't just about the incident. It was about the broader issue of systemic racism in law enforcement and the justice system. Vanessa's phone began to ring almost immediately. Calls from colleagues, reporters, and concerned citizens flooded in, each one adding to the storm that was now brewing. Vanessa took a deep breath and let the phone continue ringing. This was just the beginning. By the next morning, the courthouse was buzzing with talk of the article. Vanessa walked through the halls, feeling the eyes of every person she passed. Some were sympathetic, offering quiet nods of support. Others, however, looked away or whispered to one another as she passed. The air was thick with tension, but Vanessa walked tall, her head held high. She knew that this was more than just a personal fight. It was a fight for justice, for equality, and for the countless people who had been silenced by systems of oppression. Today was a turning point, and there was no going back. As she stepped into her courtroom and took her seat on the bench, Vanessa felt a surge of pride. This was where she belonged. No officer, no system, no prejudice could take that from her. And now, the world would know that, too. The storm breaks. The morning after the article broke, Vanessa Harper's world shifted. The once familiar courthouse halls felt different. The air was thicker, the tension palpable. Conversations halted when she walked past, eyes following her as she made her way through the building that had once felt like home. As she approached the elevator, Vanessa overheard snippets of hushed conversations. Her colleagues, judges, lawyers, clerks, were all talking about the article. She could sense the mix of emotions. Some were supportive, others wary, and a few, no doubt, displeased that she had taken such a public stand. Vanessa wasn't naive. She knew that her decision to go public would upset many people in positions of power, especially those who benefited from the system as it was. But this wasn't about keeping people comfortable. This was about forcing the uncomfortable truths into the light. As the elevator doors slid open, Vanessa was greeted by the familiar faces of her staff. Marcus, her trusted clerk, and Janet, her court reporter. They both smiled warmly, their loyalty unwavering, but even in their expressions, Vanessa could see the unease. They understood the magnitude of what was happening. "Good morning, Judge Harper," Janet said, handing her the day's case files. "Good morning," Vanessa replied, her voice steady. She appreciated their support, but she could see the questions in their eyes, the unspoken thoughts swirling behind their smiles. They weren't just worried about her, they were worried about what might come next. As they walked toward the courtroom, Marcus hesitated for a moment, falling behind as the other staff members entered. He caught Vanessa's eye and motioned for her to stop. "Judge, do you have a minute?" he asked quietly, his voice low so as not to draw attention from the others. Vanessa nodded, stepping aside with him. She could tell by the serious look on his face that whatever he had to say wasn't just idle chatter. "What's on your mind, Marcus?" she asked, folding her arms, her tone gentle but curious. Marcus glanced around before speaking, ensuring they weren't being overheard. "I've been hearing some things," he said carefully. "Rumor has it that the police department is not happy. Word's going around that they're planning to respond publicly." Vanessa raised an eyebrow, but didn't seem surprised. "I expected as much," she said calmly. "They can't ignore this story. It's too big." Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly worried. "Yeah, but there's more. I heard that the officer who stopped you, Officer Daniels, he's trying to spin it as if it was all a misunderstanding. He's claiming he didn't know you were a judge and that you were being uncooperative." Vanessa's lips pressed into a thin line. She had expected resistance, but to have the officer already trying to manipulate the narrative wasn't something she had anticipated this quickly. "So he's trying to play the victim." Marcus nodded. "And the department is backing him. They're putting together a statement that frames the whole incident as a miscommunication, downplaying the racism and saying that they'll look into it, but we both know that's code for brushing it under the rug." Vanessa's eyes hardened. She had seen this tactic before. It was a classic move. Downplay the incident, deflect responsibility, and shift the blame. The truth was inconvenient, and they would do everything in their power to dilute its impact. "I won't let them get away with this," Vanessa said, her voice steely. "This is bigger than one officer's misconduct. This is about the entire system." Marcus nodded but still looked troubled. "I know, Judge, but they're coming for you. They're going to try and discredit you, make it look like you're overreacting, that you're playing the race card." Vanessa sighed, though her resolve didn't waver. She knew what was coming: personal attacks, attempts to undermine her reputation, and the inevitable media circus that would follow. But this was the path she had chosen, and she would not be deterred. "I've dealt with worse than this, Marcus," she said, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Let them come. I won't back down." Just as they finished talking, the courtroom doors opened, and the first case of the day was about to begin. Vanessa straightened her robe and walked into the courtroom, her face a mask of calm professionalism. But inside, she knew the storm was brewing. By midday, the courthouse was buzzing. The news of Officer Daniels' statement had broken, and it was clear that the police department was standing behind him. The official line from the department claimed that Daniels had been enforcing standard courthouse security protocols and that Judge Harper had been uncooperative when asked for identification. They insisted that race had nothing to do with the incident and that the officer had acted appropriately given the circumstances. The media ate it up. Headlines screamed with accusations of misunderstanding and miscommunication. News anchors speculated about the he said, she said nature of the event, as if racism were merely a difference of opinion rather than a deeply ingrained reality. But Vanessa wasn't surprised. This was exactly what she had expected. A coordinated effort to shift the narrative, to paint her as overreacting, and to neutralize the growing outrage. Rachel called her that afternoon. "They're trying to bury this," she said, her voice filled with frustration. "They've spun it into a story about courthouse security, completely ignoring the racial aspect." "I knew they would," Vanessa replied, her voice steady. "But we're not done yet." Rachel sighed. I hope you're right. There are people already questioning your credibility, saying you should have handled it quietly instead of going public. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, feeling the weight of the fight ahead of her. That's exactly why I went public, Rachel. This isn't just about me. It's about every black person who walks into a courthouse or any public space and wonders if they'll be treated equally. I can't let them sweep this under the rug. Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing her words. So, what's the next move? Vanessa's mind raced. She had anticipated this response from the police department, but she needed to shift the narrative back in her favor. We need to get more voices involved. This can't just be my story. We need other judges, lawyers, community leaders, anyone who has experienced or witnessed racial bias in the justice system, to speak up. Rachel's voice brightened with determination. I'll reach out to some people. We'll make this bigger. We'll turn it into a national conversation. Vanessa felt a flicker of hope. This wasn't just about an article anymore. This was about igniting a movement. Good. Let's do it. The next few days were a whirlwind. As Rachel worked her contacts in the media, Vanessa focused on rallying support within the legal community. She reached out to other black judges, lawyers, and civil rights groups, encouraging them to come forward with their own experiences of racial bias within the justice system. The response was overwhelming. Judges who had remained silent for years began to speak out, sharing stories of being disrespected by officers, questioned in their own courthouses, and undermined by colleagues who viewed them as less than their white counterparts. The floodgates had opened, and suddenly, Vanessa's story was no longer an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger narrative about the systemic racism that permeated every corner of the legal system. As the voices grew louder, so did the public outcry. Social media was flooded with posts calling for justice, demanding accountability not just for Officer Daniels, but for the entire system that allowed his behavior to go unchecked. The pressure on the police department mounted. What had started as a single incident had now become a national conversation about race, power, and the law. And in the middle of it all stood Vanessa, a calm, unyielding force. By the end of the week, the courthouse was surrounded by reporters. Camera crews lined the steps, journalists eager to capture the latest development in what had become the most talked about story in the country. Vanessa walked past them, her face calm, her steps purposeful. She had become a symbol of resilience, a woman who refused to back down in the face of injustice. As she stepped into her chambers, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Rachel. Vanessa, they've scheduled a press conference. The police chief is going to address the incident publicly. You'll want to watch this. Vanessa's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the moment she had been waiting for. The reckoning. Vanessa Harper sat at her desk, her eyes fixed on the muted television screen in her chambers. The room was unusually still as she waited for the inevitable. The press conference where the police chief would address the growing controversy. It had been a whirlwind few days, but today, everything felt suspended, as if the whole city was holding its breath. Rachel's message echoed in Vanessa's mind. The police chief is going to address the incident publicly. You'll want to watch this. She knew what was coming. This was the department's chance to shape the narrative, to take control of the situation, and to quell the public outrage. They had already been working behind the scenes to downplay the incident, framing it as a misunderstanding and stripping it of its racial undertones. But now, under the pressure of the national spotlight, they could no longer ignore the weight of the truth. Marcus walked into her chambers, his face lined with concern. He had been Vanessa's rock throughout the past week, but even he couldn't mask the unease that hung in the air. Are you ready for this? Marcus asked, his voice quiet but steady. Vanessa turned to him, offering a faint smile. Ready as I'll ever be. He pulled up a chair beside her, and together they watched the screen as the camera zoomed in on the podium outside the police station. The crowd of reporters surged forward, eager for the chief's statement. The anticipation was electric, and Vanessa could feel the tension rising, the weight of what was about to be said. The camera panned to Police Chief Michael Carson, a tall, stoic man with a hard-lined face, walking toward the podium. He was flanked by several senior officers, including Officer Daniels, who stood to the side, his face composed, but Vanessa could see the arrogance in his posture. Daniels was playing his part as the victim in all this, and the department was more than willing to protect him. The chief cleared his throat, glancing briefly at the crowd of cameras and microphones. "Good afternoon," he began, his deep voice echoing over the murmur of the press. "I want to address the recent incident involving Officer Daniels and Judge Vanessa Harper." Vanessa leaned forward, her heart beating faster. This was the moment she had been preparing for. Whatever came next would define the battle ahead. Chief Carson continued. The interaction between Officer Daniels and Judge Harper was a regrettable situation, one that has understandably drawn public attention. Officer Daniels was performing his duty in ensuring courthouse security, and it appears that a misunderstanding took place. Vanessa's jaw clenched. Misunderstanding. It was the same word they had used over and over again to minimize what had happened. But she knew, everyone knew, it was much more than that. Officer Daniels followed standard protocol. The chief said, his tone measured. He did not immediately recognize Judge Harper, and when asked for identification, Judge Harper did not immediately comply. This led to a breakdown in communication. Marcus shifted in his seat, glancing at Vanessa. "They're sticking to their story," he muttered. The chief pressed on, his eyes scanning the crowd, clearly trying to project control. "While we understand the sensitivity of the situation, we must emphasize that Officer Daniels was acting in good faith in line with his training. We are, however, conducting an internal review to ensure that all our officers are following proper procedures when interacting with members of the public, especially in a courthouse setting." Vanessa felt her stomach turn. They were washing their hands of any responsibility. The racism, the profiling, the humiliation she had endured, it was all being swept under the rug as an unfortunate communication breakdown. But then, Chief Carson's expression hardened. He wasn't done yet. "That being said," he continued, "we also want to address the fact that this incident has become a point of contention in the media. While we respect Judge Harper's right to express her concerns, we must also caution against inflammatory rhetoric that could divide our community." Vanessa's eyes widened. He was turning this on her, painting her as the aggressor, the one who had escalated the situation by speaking out. The chief's words were clear. Don't stir the pot. Don't question the system. The reporters buzzed with questions, their hands shooting into the air. But Chief Carson wasn't taking any. He offered a tight nod and quickly left the podium, with Officer Daniels following close behind. The press conference was over, but the message had been delivered loud and clear. Vanessa sat back in her chair, her mind racing. This was exactly what she had feared, a calculated move to discredit her, while shielding the officer and the institution. They had framed her fight for justice as a dangerous disturbance to the peace. "This is outrageous," Marcus said, standing up and pacing the room. "They're trying to make you look like the problem, like you're overreacting." Vanessa didn't respond right away. She had expected resistance, but the blatant dismissal of the core issue, the racism, had struck a nerve. Her reputation, her career, everything she had worked for was now in jeopardy, not because she had done anything wrong, but because she dared to speak out. "They're protecting the system," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "This is how it works. Silence the truth-tellers. Make it seem like the problem is with the people who speak up, not with the system that oppresses." Marcus shook his head in disbelief. "So, what do we do now?" Vanessa stood, her resolve hardening. "We keep pushing. We don't let them control the narrative. They may have had their say, but this isn't over. Not by a long shot." She picked up her phone and dialed Rachel, who answered almost immediately. "Vanessa, did you see that?" Rachel's voice was a mix of outrage and frustration. "They're trying to bury this, turn it into a non-issue." Vanessa nodded, though Rachel couldn't see her. "I saw. But we're not going to let them. We need to push back harder. This is bigger than just what happened to me. It's about how the system protects itself, no matter how wrong it is." Rachel's tone shifted, determination seeping through the line. "I'm with you. We're going to expose everything. I've already got some contacts in civil rights organizations who are ready to step in. We need to make this bigger. They can't downplay this if we've got the public behind us." Vanessa's mind raced. "Let's do it. Organize interviews, rallies, whatever it takes. I'll reach out to the local bar association and some of the black judges in the area. We'll make this impossible for them to ignore." By the end of the day, Vanessa's phone was buzzing with calls and messages. Civil rights groups were mobilizing, legal professionals were speaking out, and community leaders were rallying in support. The press conference had backfired in a way the police department hadn't anticipated. It had galvanized the very people they were trying to silence. A few days later, Vanessa stood in front of a packed auditorium, the glare of camera lights bright in her eyes. The room was filled with reporters, activists, lawyers, and everyday citizens who had come to show their support. The energy was electric, a wave of solidarity that Vanessa could feel coursing through the room. Rachel stood by her side, along with a panel of civil rights leaders, including prominent attorneys and community advocates. They had spent the last several days organizing this event, making sure that the truth was heard loud and clear. Vanessa stepped up to the podium, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. She knew what this moment meant, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or discriminated against because of the color of their skin. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice carrying over the crowd. "I'm here today not just as a judge, but as a black woman who has experienced firsthand the injustices that are still deeply rooted in our system. What happened to me at the courthouse was not an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the prejudice that permeates our institutions, prejudice that goes unchecked, unchallenged, and all too often, unpunished." The room was silent, hanging on her every word. "I will not allow this incident to be swept under the rug," she continued. "I will not allow the police department, or any institution, to downplay the racism and disrespect that I, and so many others, have endured. This is not just about one officer. This is about a system that protects its own at the expense of justice and equality." Applause erupted from the audience, a roar of support that filled the room. Vanessa's voice grew stronger, her conviction unwavering. "I stand here today to say that enough is enough. We will not be silent. We will not be dismissed. And we will not stop until the system is held accountable." The applause swelled again, and Vanessa knew this was more than a reckoning. This was the beginning of a movement, a new dawn. The day after Vanessa Harper's powerful speech, the world felt different. For the first time in what seemed like forever, she could feel the momentum shifting. The auditorium had been packed with supporters, and her words had resonated far beyond the walls of that room. It wasn't just about her anymore. This was about a collective voice that had been silenced for far too long. And now, that voice was growing louder, stronger, impossible to ignore. News outlets across the country were replaying clips from her speech. The headlines, once fixated on Officer Daniel's side of the story, had shifted. "Judge Harper speaks out against systemic racism and justice, equality, and the fight for truth." "Judge Harper takes a stand" were just some of the stories that now dominated the airwaves. Social media had exploded with support, with hashtags like #JusticeForJudge Harper and #EndSystemic Racism trending globally. Vanessa had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of hope. As Vanessa sat at her kitchen table, sipping her morning coffee, the magnitude of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just about the confrontation at the courthouse door anymore. This had become a movement, a rallying cry for change, and she was at its center. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from Rachel. "Turn on the news. Chief Carson is about to make another statement." Vanessa felt her stomach tighten. The police department had been on the defensive ever since the press conference. Public outcry had been relentless, and with the community, civil rights groups, and even legal professionals demanding justice, the department had no choice but to respond. She grabbed the remote and turned on the television, just as the familiar figure of Police Chief Michael Carson appeared on the screen. The backdrop was the same as before, the stone facade of the police department, the flags waving in the wind. But this time, something was different. There was a weariness in Carson's posture, and his eyes lacked the confidence they had carried during the first press conference. "Good morning," he began, his voice sounding more subdued than before. "Over the past few days, the incident involving Officer Daniels and Judge Harper has sparked an important conversation in our community and across the nation. We have listened to the concerns raised by our citizens, and we understand the gravity of the situation." Vanessa leaned forward in her seat, her heart pounding. She could feel it. This was the moment they had been waiting for. As a result, Carson continued, "We have decided to conduct an independent review of the incident, with the involvement of civil rights organizations and community leaders. Officer Daniels has been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation." Marcus called Vanessa right as the words left Carson's mouth. "Are you seeing this?" he asked, his voice filled with a mix of disbelief and cautious optimism. "I'm watching," Vanessa replied, her eyes still glued to the screen. "This is huge," Marcus said, his excitement barely contained. "They're finally taking action." It was true. The police department, which had initially tried to sweep the incident under the rug, was now being forced to confront the issue head-on. The public pressure had become too much to ignore. The voices of the community, amplified by Vanessa's bravery, had demanded accountability. And they were finally getting it. But Vanessa knew this was only the beginning. Placing Officer Daniels on leave was one step, but it didn't address the deeper issues that had allowed this situation to happen in the first place. The system was still broken, and fixing it would take far more than one officer's suspension. Chief Carson's voice pulled her back to the present. "We also recognize that this incident has highlighted broader concerns about racial bias in law enforcement and within the justice system itself. In response, we will be working with local leaders, activists, and members of the judiciary to address these issues and to ensure that our officers receive the training and guidance necessary to serve all members of our community with fairness and respect." Vanessa's heart swelled with a mix of pride and resolve. This was what she had been fighting for, not just for her own dignity, but for systemic change. For every person who had ever been profiled, disrespected, or mistreated by a system that was supposed to protect them. The press conference ended, and Vanessa sat back in her chair, letting out a long, slow breath. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The road ahead would be long, and the fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, Vanessa felt hope, real hope. In the days that followed, the movement continued to gain traction. Community leaders organized rallies and town hall meetings, bringing together people from all walks of life to discuss the changes needed in the justice system. Vanessa attended as many of these events as she could, often speaking alongside civil rights activists and local politicians who had joined the cause. At one of the largest rallies, held in the city's central square, Vanessa stood in front of a massive crowd, the courthouse looming in the background. The air was charged with energy, and as she looked out over the sea of faces, young and old, black and white, all united for a common cause, she felt a deep sense of purpose. "Thank you all for being here today," she began, her voice amplified by the microphone. "What we are doing here is not just about one incident or one officer. It's about a system that has failed too many people for far too long. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers filling the square. "We are here to demand justice," Vanessa continued. "But justice is not just about punishing one individual. It's about creating a system where everyone, no matter the color of their skin, their background, or their status, can walk into a courthouse, or down a street, or into any public space, and know that they will be treated with dignity and respect." More applause, louder this time, and Vanessa felt the momentum building. "We must continue to push," she said, her voice rising with passion. "We must hold our leaders, our institutions, and ourselves accountable. This is not just about me. This is about every person who has been told they don't belong, every person who has been made to feel less than, every person who has been denied their rights." The crowd surged with energy, their cheers echoing off the buildings around them. "And let me be clear," Vanessa said, her voice cutting through the noise. "We will not stop until the changes we need are made. This is a fight for our future, for our children, for the generations to come. And together, we will win." The roar of the crowd was deafening, and Vanessa stood at the podium, taking it all in. This was bigger than her now. This was a movement, a revolution. Months passed, and the changes Vanessa had fought for began to take root. The independent review of Officer Daniels concluded, and he was removed from the force. But more importantly, the city instituted sweeping reforms within the police department. Officers were required to undergo extensive racial bias training, and a civilian oversight board was established to hold law enforcement accountable. But the impact didn't stop at the local level. Vanessa's fight had inspired similar movements in cities across the country, sparking conversations about racial justice in courthouses, police departments, and government offices. It wasn't an overnight transformation. Progress never was, but it was a step in the right direction, a new dawn in the fight for equality. Vanessa continued her work as a judge, presiding over cases with the same fairness and integrity she always had. But now, when she walked into the courthouse, she felt something different. She felt seen, respected, and she knew that her presence, her very existence in that space, was a victory in itself. One morning, as she walked through the courthouse doors, Marcus caught up to her. "Judge Harper," he said, smiling, "it's good to see you this morning. How are you feeling?" Vanessa smiled back, her eyes bright with determination. "I'm feeling good, Marcus. It's a new day." They walked together through the bustling halls, passing by lawyers, clerks, and citizens, all going about their business. But this time, the air was different. There was no tension, no hostility, only the hum of activity in a place where justice was supposed to prevail. As Vanessa took her seat on the bench, she glanced out at the courtroom, filled with people waiting for their cases to be heard. And in that moment, she knew this was where she belonged. This was her court, her domain. And as long as she was here, justice would not be denied. The fight wasn't over. There was still much work to be done. But Vanessa Harper, the woman who had been stopped at the courthouse door because of the color of her skin, had become something far greater than she had ever imagined. She had become a beacon of hope, a symbol of resilience, and a force for change. And the dawn of a new era had just begun.